Greetings from Canberra. I'm glad to be joining in this summit with you, even if I have to do so virtually. Can't be there in person with you. I'm going to be speaking about the new Memory of the World guidelines. Now, after a pause of 4 years, the International Memory of the World Register has reopened for new nominations this year. A revised version of the general guidelines and the Memory of the World Companion have been adopted, and while the criteria for assessing the world significance of documentary heritage haven't changed, and my colleague Professor Sue will be speaking to you on this topic, the new guidelines bring some changes to the design of the nomination form and the processing of nominations through the Memory of the World system. I'd like to speak first about some aspects of constructing a nomination using this revised form, and then reflect on some contextual issues relating to the changes that have now taken place. This year's intake has a deadline of the 30th of November, so if you intend to submit a nomination and you haven't yet started work on preparing it, it's probably a little too late to make the cut. Rather, you have plenty of time to work on preparing for the next biennial round, which will have a submission date of 2023. Let's talk about completing the nomination form. My first tip is that you should use both the general guidelines and the Memory of the World Companion as your reference point in constructing your nomination. If you do this, you won't go too far wrong. So I'm not going to walk through every section of the form now, but I'm going to emphasise some points that in my experience you should pay particular attention to. Firstly, there's the title and the opening summary. And you devise these last, not first, after you've drafted the rest of your nomination. They're important because they are the shop window of your nomination and need to encapsulate the essentials. To use a journalistic analogy, they're like the headline and first paragraph of a press release. While the Memory of the World Register Subcommittee will analyse and assess your nomination thoroughly, others in the system may not always have time to read it in full. So you need to explain in that 200-word summary how your nomination meets the criteria for inscription. Secondly, your nomination needs to be completely factual and objective in its language and its arguments. This takes some care. It is harder than it sounds, because this is not the way most of us converse in everyday life. It is surprising how often claims are made that a particular nominated document or collection is the best, the first, the most complete, or some other superlative, when no hard evidence is offered to support that assertion. Nor is it helpful to put a particular historical slant or interpretation into your argument. A nomination is not a vehicle for propaganda or a polemic. This only makes the assessment more difficult. You must simply allow the documentary heritage to speak for itself. Ultimately, its significance will rest on two questions. First, why would the loss of this documentary heritage impoverish the heritage of humanity? And second, what has been its impact, positive or negative, on life and culture beyond the boundaries of a nation, state or region? Thirdly, think about the people who will be assessing your nomination. Initially on the Register Subcommittee and later on the International Advisory Committee. The most intensive work happens in the Register Subcommittee, where correspondence with your referees will be entered into and your claims will be researched against authoritative sources before the Register Subcommittee arrives at a preliminary assessment. So, make the job easier by providing the maximum information that you can in each section of the nomination form. At the same time, don't be wordy. Keep to the point. Repetition does not strengthen your argument. It tends to have the opposite effect. There's no rule about this, but you should be able to say all you need to say in no more than about 15 A4 pages. Sometimes, by way of larger explanation, it's useful to add more detail. For example, if you want to offer a more detailed catalogue of a collection or an extended bibliography, and in such cases, you can append this information separately on one or more annexes, separate from the flow of the nomination itself. Fourthly, it is said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. If it's relevant, annex some illustrations of the document you are nominating, or even a short video file, since you will now be lodging your nomination electronically. It's immensely helpful to have a visual impression of the heritage. It's surprising how often nominators neglect this. We live in a visual age, and it has never been more important or easier or more important to transmit visual information in a variety of forms. Fifth, and this is so often treated too lightly, be frank and realistic about the condition of the nominated heritage and any risks it might be facing. Is it in good condition, or is it deteriorating? Is conservation treatment needed? How secure is it? What are the storage conditions, temperature and humidity? Has it been digitised? How is access controlled? These are all elements of a management plan. If a plan does not already exist, there can be a very good reason for creating one. It's essential to know these things because they're the starting point for periodic monitoring. Every 6 years, in accordance with the 2015 UNESCO recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form, all heritage inscribed on the register will be systematically monitored to check its condition and ensure its integrity has not been compromised. If inscribed material is at risk, the fact of inscription provides a useful basis for seeking the necessary funding for preservation measures. Advice and assistance in completing a nomination form is always available. The Korean National Commission for UNESCO has been a global leader in organising training workshops for this purpose. You can also go to the Memory of the World website, find the International Register and drill down on individual inscriptions to find the original nomination forms. You can analyse how they're compiled. Checking a few examples will give you a good feel for how to develop your own nomination. Now, I want to turn briefly by some background to some recent history and explain why the normal operation of the Memory of the World International Register was interrupted for 4 years. The last revision of the general guidelines occurred back in the pre-digital days of 2002, when the Memory of the World program was very small. By 2015, the International Advisory Committee decided that the guidelines needed to be revised and updated because technology, as well as the operating context of the program, had changed so much. Not only had Memory of the World become a much larger enterprise with national and regional committees operating all around the world, there was a need for it to conform to the new recommendation on documentary heritage, which I have just mentioned. Accordingly, the International Advisory Committee appointed a working group, which I chaired, to consult widely and produce a revised text of the general guidelines. The International Advisory Committee approved that new text in December 2017. Subsequently, however, UNESCO's Executive Board decided to initiate a further review, this time by an open-ended working group. This took a further 3 years. It therefore suspended operation of the International Register in the meantime. Should you wish to, you can follow this sequence of events on the Memory of the World website. Now, the background to this lengthy process was the International Advisory Committee's consideration at the same time of a Korean-coordinated nomination concerning documentary heritage on the World War II comfort women system, held in institutions spread across several countries. There's a large literature on this topic, including on the nomination itself, and I don't need to expand on it here. I'm sure you know about it. But this consideration gave rise to issues which impacted on the revision of the general guidelines and led to the long suspension of the register nomination process. We're now working on the revised text of the guidelines, which was ultimately approved by UNESCO's Executive Board in April this year. So I'd like to focus now on some features of the new guidelines which differ from its predecessor. Nominations to the International Register must now be submitted through UNESCO national commissions and not directly to the Member of the World Secretariat in Paris as in the past. Obviously, in the case of Korea, this ensures that your national commission is aware at the outset of your nomination and by the fact of submission, it is expressing support of it. The existing limit of 2 nominations per country per biennial cycle still stands. This is purely a practical way of limiting the workload on the Register Subcommittee and the International Advisory Committee. If there are more than 2 nominations offering in any cycle, the National Commission will have to choose which 2 nominations go forward. As before, there is no limit to the number of joint nominations involving 2 or more countries. Nominations are checked for admissibility by the Register Subcommittee. In effect, it means ensuring that they are properly completed with all required information. They are uploaded to the Member of the World platform, where they're accessible to permanent delegations to UNESCO, national commissions and the Member of the World community of regional and national Member of the World committees. Over a prescribed period, usually 60 days, Member States and national Member of the World committees may provide comments and additional information on any nomination, or may contest the nomination on the grounds of its content or whether admissibility or selection criteria have been met. This provision is quite new. The guidelines set out some detailed provisions for dealing with contested nominations, but in essence it involves setting up a dialogue between the concerned parties, with the costs of the exercise being met by the parties themselves or by voluntary contributions. In the meantime, the nomination file is stored on the Member of the World platform as a pending nomination, accessible only to the concerned parties. There is no time limit to the dialogue process. A further development is the formalisation of a process for adding to existing inscriptions on the International Register. Sometimes inscribed collections may prove over time to be incomplete or to be overtaken by new discoveries. An obvious example is where a collection is spread over multiple institutions and further parts of it are later identified. To take another example, some individual documents, such as feature films or printed books, are released in variant versions or multiple languages. So the nomination relates to the intellectual entity, the work itself, rather than the specific copy that's been cited. If further copies of comparable integrity and antiquity are subsequently identified, they may be proposed for addition to an existing inscription or may even replace the exemplar that's currently inscribed. A third possibility relates to the dynamic nature of born digital material inscribed on the register. It may require an update subsequent to the original inscription. Finally, it's important to note that the process for approval of inscriptions to the International Register now has an additional step. It is still the case that the Register Subcommittee researches and assesses each nomination and provides a preliminary recommendation to the International Advisory Committee. In turn, the International Advisory Committee makes its recommendation to the Director General of UNESCO. In the past, the Director General was the final point of decision. Now, the Director General must also seek the endorsement of UNESCO's Executive Board to the IFC's recommendations. This brings a new dynamic into the decision-making process that's yet to be tested. It can potentially mean that any nomination may become the subject of further debate in that forum, which comprises a constantly changing group of representatives of 58 member states elected by the UNESCO General Conference. The internal politics of the Executive Board, which will tend to reflect the current membership of that body, can therefore impinge on the success or otherwise of a nomination. Now finally, some reflections. I've been involved in the Memory of the World program in various capacities over about the last 25 years. I've observed the growth and success of the International Register in particular. There is clear evidence of its influence in protecting and preserving documentary heritage, in raising public awareness, in assisting fundraising for preservation, and in supporting the custodian institutions who care for the heritage. I've spoken to the directors of libraries and archives who've confirmed this and offered specific examples in their institution by way of demonstration. Even so, some very strange assumptions about the register do float around. For example, you'll be amazed at how often I've come across people who assume that nominating to the International Register is some sort of competition, that I'll win if my nomination is better than your nomination. I have to patiently explain that this is never the case. Every nomination is considered separately on its own merits against the criteria, never comparatively against other nominations. There are no winners or losers. Yet, in spite of efforts to widen the scope of the register, it is still Eurocentric. Over half the current inscriptions come from Europe. Asia comes in second, followed in turn by Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and then the Arab states. Asia's presence is growing thanks to the efforts of MOCAP, the Regional Committee for Memory of the World in Asia and Pacific, and the workshops that are funded by the Republic of Korea. Looked at from another angle, there's an obvious lack of inscriptions that represent the voices of women, Indigenous people, and minorities. The voices of old white men predominate. And it is traditional textual material and textual documents that still dominate. Even though we live in an audiovisual age where recorded images and sounds, from feature films and oral histories to Instagram, Twitter and TikTok, now dominate everyday communication and wield enormous influence. A single tweet can move the world. So clearly the balanced evolution of the register has further to go. I encourage you to nominate. Ask for help if you need it. There is much more heritage of significance that needs to be brought into the light. Thank you.